stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race, so I don't have to run this race in vain.
Marcus Garvey. They called him Black Moses because he would have led thousands of blacks back to their promised land, Africa. Because he preached black separatism and urged his people to return to their place of origin, he was often at odds with other black leaders and the white establishment. Garvey found his inspiration for African nationalism while traveling in Europe. In England, he sharpened his focus by reading Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. The book tells the inspirational tale of Washington's life from slavery in Virginia to the founding of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. As he read, Garvey was drawn in. He said later, "My doom, if I may call it, of being a race leader dawned on me." Now, sure of his destiny, Garvey went straight from England to his native Jamaica, where he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born on August 17, 1887, in Jamaica's northern coast. As the privileged son of a tradesman and landowner, Marcus Garvey knew little of class boundaries or racism. His first lesson in prejudice came at 14, when the parents of a little white girl he played with ordered her never to see Garvey again. They called him nigger. He began to realize, for the first time, that there were different races, each having its own separate and distinct social life.
Marcus Garvey grew up in Jamaica. Marcus Garvey encountered racism in a slightly different fashion than those encountered it in the United States. However, he encountered racism nonetheless.
Garvey believed himself to be a part of a group that was underprivileged in this country, based, he thought, on the color of his skin. There was in his country a kind of a pyramid, starting with the whitest people and going to the blackest people at the bottom of that social ladder.
At 18, Garvey moved to Kingston, Jamaica's capital, to work in his uncle's print shop. During his years in Kingston, Garvey became fully aware of the unfair racial divisions in Jamaican society. By his early 20s, he had become deeply immersed in political activities and efforts to improve the status of Jamaican blacks. Marcus believed he had a calling to help organize people, but he needed more experience of the world. In 1910, at the age of 23, he set out for Costa Rica. There, Garvey took a job on a banana plantation owned by the United Fruit Company. This giant United States firm controlled much of the fruit production in Latin America and was rapidly clearing land for new plantations. People worked long, hard hours for low wages in squalid conditions.
In the late 19th century, African peoples in Central America and the Caribbean, South America, and North America were victimized by various kinds of discrimination that was really left over from their status as slaves in those societies. At the end of slavery, they hoped that they would be integrated into these societies as equal citizens. Unfortunately, that was not the case.
Distressed by what he saw, Garvey began a crusade to improve working conditions. However, after many efforts, it became clear to Garvey that white officials did not value the lives of black people. Leaving Costa Rica, Garvey traveled to Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, and other Latin American nations. Everywhere he found black workers who had fled the poverty of one country to find similar conditions in another.
And he said that if black people in Jamaica and the United States and in Central America and South America come together, work together, pool their resources, they will not only be able to advance themselves economically, they would be able to put pressure on the political institutions in those societies to grant them equal rights. And so he felt that the first step in terms of gaining first-class citizenship in these societies was to build up a strong black society and strong black institutions.
After trying unsuccessfully for 2 years to organize migrant laborers to protest their unfair treatment, Garvey grew discouraged. Finally, in 1912, worn out from a bout with malaria, he returned to Jamaica. Back home again, Garvey organized a delegation to bring the migrant workers' problems to the attention of the governor of Jamaica. The governor did not want to help, and Garvey decided to go to London, where British colonial policy was decided. Garvey hoped to find people there who would help the West Indian workers. In 1912, at the age of 25, Garvey sailed for England. There, Garvey found work on the docks and learned from black seamen of indignities that blacks suffered in other countries. He concluded that no matter where they lived, the people of his race shared a common bond of suffering.
He had traveled throughout the world and he had seen similar things, and he noticed patterns. And he thought that there needed to be a common answer to this, what he called uplifting of the race. So he set out to do this.
Garvey was introduced to the idea of Pan-Africanism, the belief that blacks throughout the world are one people with Africa as their common home. The Pan-African movement was devoted to establishing African nations entirely governed by Africans. More and more, he came to accept the belief that blacks throughout the world must unite and wrest Africa from its colonial occupiers. In 1913, Marcus Garvey read a book that burned through to his soul. Up from Slavery was the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, the respected orator and educator. In the book, Washington, a former slave, urged blacks to improve themselves through education. The book posed many disturbing questions for Garvey. Where is the black man's government, his ambassador, his army? Garvey had found his purpose in life, to win these things for his people. Afire with this new vision, Garvey hurriedly returned to Jamaica, and 17 days later, formed the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association, which came to be known as the UNIA.
Garvey believed very firmly that the best way to relate to other races was to become united as a race. And he felt, therefore, that the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was his organization, should emphasize blacks' associating with and supporting other blacks. That this would be respected by whites and other racial groups as well.
The UNIA's purpose was to unite Jamaica's black population through racial pride and a program of educational and economic opportunity. Furthermore, the UNIA vowed to work for the establishment of independent black-ruled nations in Africa. His first goal was to win the support of Jamaica's poor black workers by responding to their immediate needs. He decided to make a fundraising tour of the American South. With the hope that Booker T. Washington could help, Garvey wrote to him, only to learn that the man he so admired had died. Garvey traveled to New York instead, spending his free time on street corners, explaining his program for racial solidarity to anyone who would listen. But American blacks were more interested in racial problems in their own country. Garvey saved money to begin his lecturing and fundraising tour. While he traveled, Garvey learned about the history of black Americans and became familiar with the serious problems they face throughout their country.
He would go to a town and say, there are no black leaders in this town. All of your ministers and all of your politicians are not serving you well. And then he would call a meeting at a local church or a local hall. The fact that he had challenged every black leader in town meant that they would all be there. And it was at that point that he would then put across his program.
Wherever he traveled, Garvey taught blacks to be proud of their blood, but he warned that they would only gain respect when they improved themselves. Blacks needed to unite for their own protection and obtain more education and free themselves from dependence on white employers. Garvey returned to New York, determined to have another crack at a Harlem audience. He soon got his chance.
He found a ready audience in Harlem of Africans who had just come up from Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, and Maryland, who had just come to Harlem. He found this audience knowing and understanding precisely what he was talking about the issues of race in American society. And his argument was essentially that the black man would never find justice in America, because in the American society, it was a white society the way it was being constructed by white people at the time.
He began holding weekly Sunday meetings at neighborhood churches. He established New York as the international headquarters of the UNIA. Calling upon his printing expertise, Garvey began publishing Negro World, the internationally distributed UNIA newspaper. Negro World succeeded in carrying Garvey's message to the most remote areas of Africa. Interest in the UNIA grew quickly, and the organization was soon boasting a membership in the thousands. By the middle of 1919, Garvey was claiming that the UNIA had attracted 2 million members in 30 chapters around the world.
Marcus Garvey created the largest mass movement among African Americans before the coming of the Civil Rights Movement. That is, the Universal and Negro Improvement Association had at minimum 500,000 members, but it had even more supporters of its activities and its campaigns.
As Garvey traveled around the country recruiting new members, he repeatedly emphasized the theme of universal black solidarity. Up, you mighty race, became the rallying cry of the UNIA. In speeches, Garvey continued to stress the importance of a good education. He taught followers to look to people of their own race for models and to save their admiration for black heroes. Garvey proposed that blacks stop worshiping a white god and pray to a black divine being. Garvey told his followers the things they wanted to hear, that their race could rise up and be free, proud, and powerful. His fame was beginning to spread around the globe.
And he comes to Harlem and he speaks this bold language, this tough language about Africa for Africans, and that Africans really ought to plan to go back to Africa, that we don't owe the white man anything and they don't owe us anything. I mean, this was different language for African Americans in the top of the 20th century.
There were many people in the United States who did not look kindly on Garvey's movement. Most whites believed that he was dangerous, an anti-American fanatic who was inciting blacks to attack whites. Many black intellectuals thought his ideas were crude and simplistic. But Garvey's task was immensely difficult, and he was bound to stir up controversy no matter what. Early in 1919, the UNIA founded a giant shipping company that would be owned and operated entirely by blacks. The new firm was christened the Black Star Line, and blacks were invited to buy stock through ads in the Negro world.
He wanted African Americans and Africans to trade with one another, to help to build up one another financially. In order to do this, he set up certain organizations within the UNIA. The biggest one was the Black Star Line, and it was an organization that was to purchase ships to make it possible for goods and people to travel from the United States to the West Indies to Africa, and thereby build up trade between those areas.
Another project for helping blacks was the Negro Factories Corporation, which supplied guidance and issued loans to black businesses. Buoyed by the initial success of his enterprises, Garvey sent a message to UNIA branches and other black organizations. A convention of delegates representing all the black peoples of the world would be held in New York during August 1920. The purpose of the convention was to organize the black race into a united front. Delegates came from as far away as Africa and South America. Packed convention sessions were held in Liberty Hall for 30 days. The first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world in 1920 made both blacks and whites sit up and take notice of Garvey and his program.
The outcome was the formal organization of the Universal Negro Improvement Association as an international organization. Garvey was made the President General. The mayor of Monrovia, Liberia, was made the potentate, which was supposed to be the top person in the organization. And a constitution was approved. All sorts of things were done to solidify the UNIA as an international group. About 25,000 people attended, so it was an impressive group. And the press, for the first time, got a good look at the UNIA.
The convention's most important task was the composition of the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. The Declaration condemned all forms of discrimination, lynching, unequal school systems for blacks, and the denial of equal pay for equal work. It also listed 54 rights that all countries should give to their Negro citizens. The second UNIA convention in August 1921 showed evidence of an organization in trouble. The feeling of black unity that marked the first convention was already beginning to wane. By the end of 1921, Black Star shipping operations had nearly ceased. The financial venture had failed. In spite of this, Garvey's long-cherished desire for a black church was realized. Acting at Garvey's request, the chaplain of the UNIA, George Alexander McGuire, formed the first African Orthodox church. Meanwhile, Garvey was pursuing other parts of his program. Chief among these were his efforts to secure an independent African homeland for all of the world's blacks. Many people believed that Garvey was intending to lead all blacks living outside of Africa in a return to the great continent. The UNIA, therefore, became known as a Back to Africa movement.
He was influenced to think that African Americans or people of African descent would not be able to overcome that racism which existed in the societies in the Western world. Marcus Garvey, therefore, saw that our salvation would be Africa, and that influenced him to want to try to return to Africa and to take Black America back to Africa and to seek their future there.
In January 1922, Garvey was arrested and charged for using the mail to deceive Black Star Line investors. It was the beginning of the end for Garvey and his movement.
Hoover especially set up several strategies for getting rid of Garvey, that is, getting him out of the country. It was hard because they couldn't find any violations of the law, they felt, and that's what they were looking for. And finally, they established what we believe now to be a fairly weak case of mail fraud against him.
Garvey also made a number of enemies with other Black organizations who resented his criticisms of their efforts. The most powerful of Garvey's opponents was W.E.B. Du Bois, renowned editor, writer, and co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP.
Initially, the NAACP reported the activities of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in The Crisis and various other publications. But gradually, the NAACP recognized that there was an important ideological difference between the Garveyite movement and what the NAACP stood for. That is, the Garveyites were not interested in trying to break down barriers that existed for Blacks' movement into the mainstream of American society, whereas the NAACP saw this as its major objective.
Garvey criticized the NAACP's program of racial integration. Many of Garvey's views were shared by another group. The Ku Klux Klan also believed in racial separation and purity. Early in 1922, Garvey met with them in Atlanta.
He informed the local Klan, the Klan leader, that the UNIA was not interested in integration, and that therefore, if the Klan wanted the races separated, the Garvey people had no problem with that. This was his most controversial act, because most African Americans felt that a Black leader had no business meeting with the Klan to talk about anything.
Garvey never supported the Klan's campaign of violence and terror against Blacks, but he believed that the Klan represented the true feelings of most white Americans toward Blacks. The majority of Black American leaders joined in condemning Garvey for meeting with the Klan. Controversy continued when a jury found the Black Star Line president guilty of fraud. Garvey was fined $1,000 and sentenced to serve a 5-year term in prison, the maximum sentence. In response to pressure from UNIA members, President Calvin Coolidge commuted Garvey's sentence and ordered his release after he had served about 2 years. But Garvey's troubles were not over. The U.S. government declared that as a convicted criminal, the Jamaican should be deported from the country. The UNIA was never the same again. Back in Jamaica, Garvey immediately began to rebuild the long-neglected branch of the UNIA there, and made efforts to maintain contact with American followers. Determined to sustain the growth of the association, he traveled to England in the spring of 1928. Garvey established a European headquarters for the UNIA in London and set up another branch in Paris. In August 1929, the 6th International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World was held in Kingston. Garvey was critical of the U.S. branch of the association, which had accumulated heavy debts. He was eager to sever his ties and start anew. The split became official in August of 1929. In 1935, Garvey left Jamaica for the last time and moved the UNIA headquarters to London. A few months after Garvey arrived in London, he was heartbroken by the news that the independent Black nation of Ethiopia had been attacked and invaded by Italy. His hope for Black self-rule in Africa grew weaker after Ethiopia's conquest. Ultimately, Garvey's efforts to rebuild the UNIA failed. He was barely able to support his family. In January 1940, Garvey suffered a serious stroke, leaving his right side paralyzed. As sick as Garvey was, he continued to conduct UNIA business from his home. Garvey died on June 10, 1940, at the young age of 53.
Marcus Garvey, in my judgment, represents the single most important political figure in African American history. I have the belief that if there had not been a Garvey, Garvey would have had to be created.
Students generally will see symbols and wonder what they mean. They may see a red, black, and green flag, or they may see certain other images that have to do with Africa and African Americans. All of those come in one way or another out of the Garvey movement. He's the one who designed that red, black, and green flag. He's the one who came up with a lot of the slogans that people use today that talk about the need for unity among people of African descent. And so he represented a way of thinking about self and about nation and about people that is still influential in the world today.
I think all students can look at Garvey's life. They can look at the organizations he was able to build, the theory, the philosophy, his ideology for liberation that was designed to uplift a whole people, not just people within the boundaries of one country, but people throughout the world, and how he did it, how he was able to attract so many people to accept his theories, his philosophy, and commit their lives to it.